Hi, I'm David Allsopp. I work at Tarides. I'm here with a couple of hats on this afternoon, but the first one is as one of Opam's core developers. This year has seen the 10th anniversary of Opam. Version 0.1 was released in June 2012. There was quite a lot of activity with it going on back then. I think the final 1.0 release happened within a year. There was then even more flurries of activity, and by October 2014, we got as far as Opam 1.2. There was then something of a pause. So at this point, a project was started that was going to be Opam 1.3 at this stage. It involved a massive restructuring of Opam's libraries. It changed quite a lot of internal parts of the format. Eventually, it was realized it just wasn't a minor release of Opam, and it got renamed to Opam 2.0. That took 4 years to emerge and was announced at St. Louis at the last, ICFP in person before last, 4 years ago. There were lots of features that we had to drop from Opam 2.0, even with it being that big a release, because it just had to get out of the door. So we expected that we were going to do a 2.1 release relatively soon afterwards, within a year, perhaps 18 months. In fact, it took us just under 3 years to achieve that. And that's kind of what I'd like to talk about today, is what went wrong for us in that development process, at least what went wrong in terms of our not realizing it was going to take 3 years, what we did about it, and whether there's anything that can be learned for other projects that, like Opam, are around and used quite a lot. But first of all, let's go back 4 years. Opam 1.2 to 2.0, as I started to say, everything changed. The Opam file format changed. The way you described, even the actual files that you put your Opam descriptions in, were altered. The Opam root, which is your twiddle/.opam folder, the layout of that was almost totally altered in doing it. The command line interface, as a result of that, received a huge number of changes and various overhauls in that. So everything was altered. As a result of that, we had an automatic upgrade. So a huge number of changes, but it was clear everything you could do in Opam 1.2 was available in 2.0. So we provided a one-way upgrade in Opam, but emphasis on the one-way. And Opam 2.0 spent an unusually long time in alpha, beta, and release candidate. And during that time, we were starting to get PRs for Opam repository. And in order to avoid users having to do that upgrade at each point, we actually released the repository before the release. And on the back of that, we produced automatic GitHub bot that took PRs intended for Opam 1.2 and automatically rewrote them after merge for the 2.0 repository. So we did as much as we could to support this upgrade process. But once you'd done it, it was one way, to the point that on the day Opam 2.0 was released, Opam 1.2 stopped receiving new submissions. They weren't permitted. I think we had a small handful of releases that were made for security reasons. This unequivocal one-way upgrade was something that we hadn't really seen. It wasn't just that your repository changed, it was all your users changed as well. So once that had happened, gradually, Opam 1.2 just disappears, apart from the odd user who comes back with an old operating system. But this is another story. So wind forward to Opam 2.1, we made quite a few changes internally that required us to tweak the root layout. So the Deplaix system that in Opam 2.0 was a plugin, we'd promoted to be a first-class feature in Opam 2.1. There was some configuration required for that. It just meant a few new fields inside the root layout, but nothing particularly major. That had some CLI options associated with it. There were various other new commands that we'd added because it's a new version of Opam, and why not? But crucially, we thought there were no changes to the Opam file format. So all of the Opam package descriptions that you had for Opam 2.0 were going to be exactly the same in 2.1. There were features, but not on the packaging side. So we thought this is going to be easy. And so around March, April 2020, we'd got features that from the development perspective were looking just about ready. And we were starting to pin our thoughts towards a new release. The pandemic happened. That sort of caused a little bit of delay, especially as we all had getting used to sort of working on the other end of screens. In fact, for the Opam team, it meant we started to be able to see more of each other as it happened. But we took a little bit of time working on the release criteria for Opam 2.1. But by the summer, we were getting into a place where that was looking feasible, and we were starting to think about testing it in deployments. So we started trying to use Opam 2.1 in some CI systems and other bits where we were able to get a limited amount of testing in place. And it was at this point that we started to identify some problems with it and realized what we'd missed. And the key problem was that there were two versions of Opam. So Opam 2.0 and Opam 2.1 were both going to exist at the same time, and users were going to carry on using both of them. And we had simply missed the significance of that. So what I'd like to spend the rest of this talk looking at is a few of the things that we encountered and the features that we had to implement in order to do it and why. So exhibit number 1 is a plugin called Opam Duneland. You've probably not heard of it, but you've probably indirectly used it. So this is used in our OCaml CI system to verify whether your Dune files dependencies are correctly reflected in your Opam files dependencies. This is to try to avoid the situation where you do a pull request to Opam repository and at that point discover that you don't have dependencies listed in your Opam file. From the Opam team's perspective, the critical thing about it as a plugin was that it uses Opam's libraries rather than calling the Opam command. So Opam is broken up into 5 separate libraries that you can use just as any other OCaml package, and this one was using its state library in order to load the user's local root and to be able to query package information from it. That meant that in theory, you could be an Opam 2.0 user, and you could run this plugin, and it would merrily compile the Opam 2.1 library and build this plugin. And it would then try to run it on Opam 2.0. Stay with me, it gets weird. You could also get it the other way around. So you could also be testing Opam 2.1, happen to install it, have not enabled beta packages, and so it would build the plugin with the Opam 2.0 library while trying to run on Opam 2.1. And it turned out this mismatch was really not a good thing to happen. If you were lucky, it just didn't work. If you were unlucky, it corrupted your root. Because what actually happened was that the plugin compiled against Opam 2.1 upgraded your root for you, because clearly that was what you wanted to happen. And the next time you ran Opam, it said it couldn't read the root anymore. And your only escape route was to upgrade to 2.1 before we'd even released it. So this clearly wasn't very good. It had a temporary fix. Opam Duneland was re-released in Opam repository, where it stipulated that the version of the library had to match the version of Opam that you were running. Seems easy. Meant that Opam Duneland now had to support 2 versions of an API. But it also revealed more bugs, because it meant that if you were on Opam 2.0 and you upgraded to 2.1, you had to trigger a rebuild of plugins. So all of these things were identified relatively easily, but took quite a lot of time to fix. The overall fix that we came up with, this is no good. We want to encourage people to write plugins for Opam. We want to encourage people to use the library, so we can't have a solution like this that just isn't viable. There's no technical reason for Opam 2.0 not to be able to read an Opam 2.1 root. It doesn't use the Deplaix system, doesn't use any of these new fields that are there. It would quite happily be able to get the information. So we refactored the root format, where in the past, the root was written by a version of Opam to say, right, that's it, no old versions can access this. Now it adds more metadata. So it always says this has now been written as an Opam 2.1 root, and we have an absolute rule that old versions of Opam should not attempt to write to these roots. But it also indicates 2.0 plus should be able to read this root with no problem. And that pervades all the way across the state within the root, so it can be applied to different parts. And with that, and a slightly cheeky backport release of a library in Opam 2.09, we were able to allow either of these 2 permutations to work. So Opam 2.1 only speculatively upgrades your root, so read-only access doesn't cause you suddenly to be forced to become an Opam 2.1 user. And if you're on Opam 2.0 still, then the plugins work. Problem solved, quite a lot of work. Exhibit number 2 is a little bit of a favorite of mine, because this is a feature in Opam 2.1 that I really like, even though it's not the headline one that excites just about everybody else. In Opam 2.0, when you create a switch, you specify a package, usually the compiler, that you want to put into that switch. Opam goes away, solves what will be needed. That initial creation of the switch creates a thing called the base packages, that is just a set of packages at versions that is then fixed. And the reason that we do that is in order to reduce the pressure on the solver, and also in order to mean that if you're trying to test against OCaml 4.10, you probably don't appreciate being upgraded to OCaml 5 when you next run Opam update, even though you should. So we had this system of locking the packages that we wanted to generalize a little further for the cases when it didn't work. So when it doesn't work is if you're using OCaml 4.10.0 and you want to install OCaml 4.10.1. It'd be quite nice if an upgrade just did that. In the compiler team, we would really like it if it were able to do that. There was also a problem if you were using OCaml system. So your OCaml came from your Linux distribution, and you updated that, and OCaml could change, at which point Opam needs to recompute a whole series of states, and it wasn't able to do that very easily in 2.0. So we introduced this new concept called a switch invariant, which is a formula that you say, my switch must satisfy this at all times. So the very simple switch invariant is OCaml. I want a version of OCaml in this switch, but you can add version constraints and all kinds of other things over the top of it. So this came in, it, as usual, didn't just solve Opam system upgrades, it was also quite helpful for Windows support, which is also why I was keen. But there were some options that needed to be renamed with it. And in particular, in the past, you were able to do Opam upgrade, and you could say this -- unlock base in order to say to Opam, actually, please do go ahead with this. And so we wanted to change that to update invariant. But what on earth do scripts and programs that are calling Opam have to do at this point when there are two versions of Opam around? You can say, oh, it's easy, just decide, test which version it is and probe it. But there are these options all over the place. So we could leave it as it was. But the problem there is we've got one really quite esoteric feature of Opam under one name, where a command to manipulate it uses the old esoteric name for that feature. And this seemed particularly bad. So enter a concept borrowed from our friends. Dune, as you, I think from the show of hands earlier on how many people use Dune probably know, in your Dune project file, in every single Dune project, there is a declaration of the version of Dune that your Dune files have been written for. And that was, I think that was added during Dune 1's development. It's an incredibly useful feature in Dune. It allows them to rename things and allows them to change behaviors while still preserving the behavior of old Dune builds without breaking things. So we thought, right, excellent, let's copy that for the command line. So we introduced a similar thing for Opam that we call CLI versioning. So now if you wanted to have a script that wanted to use this strange option from Opam 2.0, if you specify this environment variable at the start, that will work in any version of Opam in the 2.0 series. It does the rewrite internally to update invariant, which has the same semantic effect. So this then works in every single version of Opam. What I particularly like about this is it then means that a change of behavior in Opam 2.10 or Opam 2.20 in a few months is a bug, and we can fix it. As opposed to being something that creates an absolute nightmare of, oh, we didn't see that this change of behavior had happened, because the bug fix can be caught on the version of the CLI that brought it into being. So that's allowed us to change more than just command line parameters. And in particular, it means, just as in Dune, you don't need to deprecate. We can rename things straight away because we can guide users through. So hooray, we had one more thing to go with. This command was actually from Opam 1.2. It allows you to query variables about the Opam root. In Opam 2, it was moved to Opam var. And in Opam 2.1, we actually added more things to it because there were various configuration options for Opam where you had to be able to, in order to go through, you would have to specify edit configuration files manually. And we didn't like this anymore. We wanted to be able to have commands to alter everything, like the job count that runs in Opam. So these commands had moved and were upgraded. There had been a deprecation note on Opam config var, but there hadn't been a warning emitted by it. But we thought, this is great. We've added CLI versioning. Let's do it. So we wanted to retire Opam config var. So we used CLI versioning. It turned out it broke quite a lot, including Dune. So that wasn't going terribly well. Users were complaining. The issues were mounting up. We said, you just need to put Opam CLI equals 2.0, but for some reason, users weren't too happy with that. So perhaps there is some need to be able to deprecate things. And so at that point, we stepped back slightly on this design, adding yet another series of developer meetings and trying to work out what was wrong with this infernal design. And we realized that we'd missed something, that the lack of specifying a command line version was in fact itself a version. And we call that the default CLI, the one that users want to use. It's not expected as a user that you'd have to sit down and write on the command line every single time you run Opam which version of Opam CLI you were after. We can do something better. And so with this final change, we have hopefully 3 nice behaviors for this obscure command that renamed. So if you run the old Opam 2.0 on, I hope that's come out at a reasonable size, you get a warning, helpfully telling you it's been deprecated. It's been renamed. Here's what you should run instead, or here's what you should run if you want to get rid of this deprecation warning. But the key change was that you get the thing you asked for. You actually get the path on the command line, and you still get exit code 0. So standard errors become a little bit more noisy, but that's that. If you follow its advice, then you get nothing. It just gives you the answer as expected, because you've told it that's the behavior I was after. And then if you've actually opted into the new Opam command line, you're then able to say, well, I've done CLI equals 2.1. It says, well, that's been removed in CLI 2.1. So at this point, it says, no, that's a hard error. This thing's gone. And thanks to the way we've been able to refactor this, this actually pervades Opam's man pages automatically as well. So all of the options will tell you when they were introduced, when they were renamed as necessary, and old ones just disappear. They say this was retired with Opam 2.0. So what this has now given us is the ability to extend Opam without annoying everybody. These 3 versions that you have here hopefully create a slightly nicer user experience, both for users at the command line and script authors trying to worry about supporting multiple versions of Opam. With that, we're hopefully going to be able to spin up a release of Opam 2.2 in the next couple of months. That's the aim. I haven't got time to go through the full slew of features that we've brought in with it here, but if I can mention a few of them. We've extended this idea of switch invariants to Opam install. So where in the past you'd say Opam install and you can put packages and you can put a limited amount now, you can actually put a full formula and see what happens. We've marked that experimental because we can. Because it does now mean that Opam install can actually remove packages as well. And we're not sure what we think about that from a UX perspective, but the declarative aspect of being able to say, I would like to transform this switch to satisfy this new formula, we think could be quite interesting. And as it happens, it was a small consequence of fixing a devastatingly awful bug in Opam's computing of dependencies when trying to install dependencies. So on the back of bug fixes that hopefully you will never know about because Opam just works in the way it's supposed to, we also get a little feature. We had a grant from the Software Heritage Foundation that is an archiving service. If you've not heard of it, it's a similar idea to GitHub's Arctic Vault, except that this one's online. So they provide an archiving service for computer source code. That is the aim they're doing, to preserve our software heritage, hence its name. But the servers can be accessed. So it provides a fallback for lost upstream archives. And Opam 2.2 has the native ability to fall back to that if necessary. More importantly, Software Heritage continue to scan Opam repository and they add new releases as they go there. So in theory, retiring GitLab or OCaml' instances, or just people's websites disappearing, or even just the parts of the internet being down for a day, like GitHub's release tarbles, should no longer cause Opam systems to have to fail, because they will have a fallback, even if it necessarily has to wait while it spins up a disk somewhere to be able to access it.
You have a minute.
Thank you. There's various pinning, solver, and UI improvements and other sort of bits that we put in. That is, see the release notes when they come out. There's another tiny little feature that we've been working on, which is that finally we will be adding native Windows support in upstream Opam repository and in upstream Opam to Opam 2.2, which has only taken 7 years. Thank you very much.